morning, HFC kids. This is the story finale of what we have been learning since March. Last week, I talked a little bit about how Joshua was the young guy who set the precedent, who had faith in God when nobody older than him did, and he was able to change a generation. And now, because of Joshua's faith and because of God's loyalty to the Israelite people, this is our finale. I'm so excited, so excited. Literally, world-changing, walls-crumbling, epic tale of Joshua leading his army into the promised land. So we are in Joshua chapter 6, and Moses' generation have all died. They've all gotten old. The people who lived in Egypt, these are now just either they were little kids when they left Egypt, or they weren't even born yet when the Israelites left Egypt. Like, they don't remember back when they were in slavery. So this is a whole new group of people that God is still faithful to as descendants of Abraham. And they are getting ready to go into the promised land. And they've crossed over borders and rivers and worshiped God all along the way. They're fully trusting in the Lord at this point. And they realize that their first big obstacle, and really once this obstacle is conquered, they'll be set, is the city of Jericho. You probably know this story, but we're gonna review it today, go over a little bit more, and don't tune out, just keep listening to me, because even if you've heard it before, it's still good to listen to again, because God has done some amazing things, and we can't just forget about that. We can't just tune it out how amazing God is. And these stories should make you excited, should make you love God more, because he's the type of God that can do these kinds of amazing things. And in Joshua chapter 5, they're outside the city of Jericho. All the Israelites are camped outside of Jericho, and Jericho starts to board up their walls because they're like, oh no, there's an enemy coming. We gotta get ready for this that might go down. So they've boarded everything up, and Joshua's starting to get a little bit nervous, maybe starting to wonder, all right, what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to knock this down? I know I'm trusting in God, but I'm not really sure how that's gonna work out. And actually at the end of Joshua chapter 5, it says, when Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with a drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said, are you for us or for our adversaries, our enemies? And he said, no, I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshiped him and said, what does my Lord say to his servant? And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, take off your sandals from your feet, for the place of which you're standing is holy. And Joshua did so. So this scene looks a lot like when Moses was at the burning bush. And if you rewind to our story about the burning bush and about how God was so powerful and he came and spoke to Moses at this burning bush, he told Moses to take off his shoes, and then because he was standing on holy ground, and then he explained, I'm about to do something amazing, and it's going to help my people win. And do you remember what that was? What that big thing God did in the story of Moses after the burning bush? Do you remember? Maybe tell your moms or dads, brothers or sisters. Do you remember? This was right before Moses went back to Egypt, and God sent the 10 plagues against Pharaoh and the Egyptian army. So that was one of the last times. We've seen God show his power in a few places, but that was one of the last big showings of God's power. And so this means something big is about to happen again. Just like when God did the 10 plagues to Egypt, he's about to do something to their enemies in Jericho. So we're in Joshua chapter 6, verse 1. It says, Jericho was shut up inside and outside because of the people of Israel. No one went out and no one came in. And the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand, with its king and mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all men of war, going around the city once. And thus you should do for 6 days. 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. And on the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests will blow the trumpets. And when they take a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people will shout a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat. The people shall go up, and everyone straight before him." So Joshua, the son of Nun, Joshua, our main dude, called the priests and said to him, "Take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests bear the trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord." And he said to the people, "Go forward, march around the city, and let the armed men pass on with the ark before the Lord." So the rest of our story, so that's what happens, is God comes to Joshua and gives him these directions. So the rest of the chapter is just going over those directions. So I'm going to show you. What happens is, day 1, they're supposed to all gather together. You probably can't even tell that I stood up because I'm not much taller. But all of the people, he has these directions to stand up, to get all the army together, and they are going to walk around the city 1 time. Except it's a little bit bigger than a table because it's an entire city. And then the next day, they're supposed to walk it around 1 time. Day 2, day 3, just walking around. Day 4, walking around, and they're just following God's instructions. They're just supposed to walk around the city of Jericho. So I'm in my walking clothes, my workout clothes, because these people will have walked a long way. Every day the army would have walked around, and they carried the Ark of the Covenant, and they had big horns that they would blow. And they would walk around. Day 5, day 6, and then on the 7th day, they followed God's instructions. They probably looked really silly all of those days because all they were doing were walking around a city that wasn't even theirs. They weren't fighting. They weren't doing anything. They were just making noise and walking around the city. And when you get on the end of your 7th lap, God said, you're going to make so walk around, not 1 time, noise, not 2 times. It's going to be crazy. 7 times. Through that, you have to walk around the city 7 times. Even though you may look a little crazy, you're showing that you're following God, and God's power is going to work through that noise. So, day 7, here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And when they got to the end of the 7th lap, and they made all the noise, and they stomped their feet, and they broke things, and they screamed, and they blew trumpets, and it was crazy. But the walls started crumbling down. Those big walls, like imagine if I walked around this table 7 times and then the table just split. How crazy would that be? But this wasn't just a table. It was a whole city. Now I'm out of breath. I imagine they probably weren't that out of breath because they were so excited because now they were able to take the city. Their armor, the city's armor of their walls had all fallen off. And the people of Israel were able to run in, take everything out of the city, destroy the people, win the battle. And they saved their friend Rahab and her family, which is another story. You can ask your parents about that story. But other than that, they destroyed the whole city, and they took all of the silver and gold and bronze and then some of the animals, I believe, if I read correctly, and they dedicated all of those things to the Lord. So they didn't even keep it. It wasn't even like, now we have all of these riches, like pirates. No, they took it and they destroyed the city, and they used the riches from that city to glorify God as an offering to God, because they had such great faith. And because God had done an amazing thing for them by making the walls come down. And they were really excited that they finally got to be in their land. So now you might ask, what comes next in the book of Joshua? This is only Joshua chapter 6. And there's like all these different chapters in Joshua. Let me look exactly to see, because it's a lot. 24. There are 24 chapters in Joshua. And you might be wondering, okay, if this happens in chapter 6, what's going on for the whole rest of the book? That's a whole like 16, 17, 18 chapters doing other stuff. So what's happening? Now that they are in the land, now that they have finally made it to the promised land, they had to fight a couple other little battles. So that's a couple chapters. And they had to decide whose land was going to belong where. Have you ever moved into a new house and your mom said, all right, you're going to go in that room, and your brother's going to go into that room, and your sister's going to go into that room, and then this is mommy and daddy's room? Has that ever happened to you? You go into a new space and you have to figure out what's going to go where. That's kind of what the rest of the book is about, is he's looking at the descendants of Jacob, because remember, Jacob had 12 sons, and it started with Reuben, and then it went all the way down to Benjamin. And each of those people, each of those 12 sons, got a specific part of the land. And now that they were in this promised land, they said, okay, if your grandpa was Judah, then this is your territory. And if your grandpa was Zebulun, then you get this territory. And that's how they split up the land in the rest of Joshua. And they talked about what the inheritance is going to look like for each of these groups of people. Also, really crazy fun fact, in Genesis chapter 50, just to show that the story has come to an end, the book of Joshua ends with Joshua dying, but also at the end of the end of the book of Genesis, chapter 50, Joseph dies, and he requests that when they make it back to their land, that they take his bones, his body, and they bury it in the promised land. Since Joseph died in Egypt, he wanted to be buried in the new promised land. So Joshua ends with Joshua dying in chapter 24. He was 110 years old, and they buried him in his own land in the country of Ephraim. And then it said that he went, in verse 32, the bones for Joseph, which the people of Israel brought with them from Egypt, were buried at Shechem, which is the land that Jacob bought for these people to be buried. And all the descendants of Joseph were buried in that spot. So that's a kind of weird fun fact, but when you learn about the whole story of the Bible, like these people started with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And now here we are ending our story with Joshua, their leader, dying, and Joseph's bones being buried exactly where he wanted them to be. So that's a really cool little adding at the end of the book of Joshua. So now, the next couple weeks, moving forward, you might be wondering, what are we supposed to do now? We finished. They made it to the promised land. Is the story over? No, the story is not over. The next few weeks, we're going to be talking about how the Israelites got settled in this new land and how they're finally their own country, their own nation. And sometimes they follow God and sometimes they don't. So we're going to learn a little bit about how that played out and what those people look like, as well as start to introduce some of the other big characters of the Old Testament. So we hope to see you next week as we continue this story into like the next segment of this beautiful Old Testament story that God has given us. Thank you for coming and learning from Joshua about how God can do amazing things through his people that have faith in him. We'll see you next week, HFC kids. Actually, don't forget to tune in on Wednesday and Friday for our HFC KiDS Show and our preschool lesson. Bye. and they're supposed to blow their trumpets. So they're ha, 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 ha,